Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mighty Chan, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos, Volume 3, also known as Chapeau by Priest, and we're finishing out Arc 9 with chapters 78 through 80, and we just need to go ahead and get started because I need to know what happens after the way the last chapter ended. So without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy. Chapter 78, Fear. Guyun had witnessed the Wuarga attack before, but back then, he hadn't known what he was seeing. Chang'ung's symptoms had also been less severe then, and he'd mistaken it for a chi deviation. This time, he watched as Chang'ung curled into a ball, all the muscles in his body tense as a solid wall of steel. He was seized with violent tremors, as if enduring some extreme agony. Guyun was surprised to find that he couldn't pin him down. Chang'ung was shockingly strong. Jerking out of Guyun's hold, Chang'ung clawed at himself, his fingers hooked like the talons of a hawk. Guyun couldn't sit by and watch as he mutilated himself. He grabbed his arms. "Chang'ung!" His voice seemed to restore to Chang'ung a sliver of clarity, just enough that he froze momentarily. That worthless bedside lamp that kept failing at the most critical juncture emitted a series of wheezes before finally coming to life with a sputtering gasp, casting its dim, wavering light upon Chang'ung's blood-red eyes. Guyun was stunned. Chang'ung's lips and face were deathly pale. It was as if all the warm vitality in his body had gathered in that bloody stare, and what had previously been a set of perfectly ordinary eyes now contained a pair of twinned pupils. He looked exactly like that wicked god of legend. When Guyun had first learned about Wuarga from Miss Chun, he'd merely felt a deep ache in his heart. He hadn't truly believed some of the more outrageous effects she described. It was only now that a chill slowly crawled up his spine. Faced with Chang'ung's unfeeling, bloodthirsty eyes, this veteran general's body turned cold with fear. The two stared at each other. Guyun felt as if he'd encountered a feral beast in the wilderness, and for a moment he dared not look away. Slowly, he unclenched his fist and stretched his empty hand out to Chang'ung. Chang'ung didn't try to evade. On the contrary, as that warm hand pressed against his cheek, he lowered his head and nuzzled into Guyun's palm with a blank expression. "Do you know who I am?" Guyun asked quietly, his heart in his throat. Chang'ung lowered his uncommonly thick lashes and breathed. "Tsushi." Thank goodness. Chang'ung could still recognize him. Guyun sighed in relief, failing to notice the strangeness of his tone. But he'd relaxed too soon. Before the breath could fully escape him, Chang'ung made a grab for his throat. "I won't let you leave!" The throat was the most vulnerable part of the body. Guyun instinctively flinched back and parried that ice-cold hand. Pressing his advantage, Chang'ung caught Guyun's wrist, yanking it violently down. Guyun curled his fingers and jabbed at the sensitive knot of nerves in Chang'ung's elbow. In that small space there on the bed, the two exchanged several blows in rapid succession. This lunatic was an exemplary martial artist to begin with, but now, possessed by the spirit of a wicked god, his strength became still more extraordinary as he struck out wildly. By contrast, Guyun was afraid of accidentally hurting him. On the verge of breaking a sweat, he cursed furiously. "I just fucking got back. Where the hell would I go?" Suddenly, Chang'ung stilled. Guyun withdrew the hand he had pressed against Chang'ung's neck and rapped him lightly on the chin with his knuckles. "Wake up!" Perhaps this strike was too weak. Not only did it fail to rouse Chang'ung, it had made him narrow his bloody eyes. Like an enraged leopard, he turned his head and bit down on Guyun's arm. Guyun had no words. Had he known this would happen, he would have slapped him with his full strength. Guyun let out a soft hiss, the corner of his eye twitching violently. Over the course of his life, he had been hacked at with swords and blasted with bombs. But this was the first time anyone had taken a bite out of him like they were trying to eat him alive. He was sorely tempted to fling his arm out and knock loose this madman's front teeth. He stopped dead, his arm held stiff for half an age, but in the end, he couldn't bear to do it. At length, Guyun relaxed the muscles in his arm and squeezed intermittently at the back of Changgung's neck. Drawing in a sharp breath, he said, voice low, "Flaying skin, stripping tendon, eating flesh. How deep does our enmity run? Do you really hate me so much?" These words seemed to strike a nerve. Changgung blinked, and twin lines of tears rolled down without warning. Changgung made not a sound as he held the flesh of Gu Yuan's arm between his teeth and wept. The tears seemed to wash away the terrifying bloodlust in his eyes, and by intervals, Changgung's jaw slowly relaxed. Gu Yuan carefully extracted his bleeding arm, gave the wound a cursory glance, and cursed softly under his breath. Son of a bitch! Despite the imprecation, he nevertheless took Changgung into his arms. He wiped the tears from the corners of Changgung's eyes and patted him soothingly on the back. Changgung slumped against his chest for nearly an hour before slowly salvaging his mind from the maelstrom of chaos. It was like waking from a dream. He sat dazed and absent as his scattered memories gradually returned to him. When he recalled what he had just done, Changgung promptly broke into gooseflesh. His entire body, which had previously been slack as wet mud, suddenly tensed, alerting Gu Yuan that he had resurfaced. "You're awake." Feigning calm, Gu Yuan pushed Changgung away and flexed his stiff shoulders. He raised a hand and asked, "How many fingers am I holding up?" Changgung's mind was a tangled mess. He didn't dare meet Gu Yuan's eyes, but when he glanced down and saw the bite mark already scabbing over on Gu Yuan's arm, his expression turned even more unsightly. Cradling Gu Yuan's arm in his hands, his lips trembled, but he couldn't speak. "Oh, I got bitten by a dog." Gu Yuan glanced at the wound indifferently, then teased, "That dog had very straight teeth." Changgung staggered to his feet to fetch clean water and a silk handkerchief, then bowed his head and carefully cleaned Gu Yuan's wound. He looked as if he had just been violated, with not a single one of his 3 immortal souls or 7 mortal forms at home in his head, the picture of indescribable misery. Gu Yuan had been born with an overprotective nature. If he were to take personal attachments out of the equation and operate on pure feeling, perhaps the quality that moved him the most powerfully was vulnerability. To this, even beauty came second. His eyes softened as he took in this scene. Lifting his hands, he began gently combing through Changgung's mussed hair with his fingers. "Last autumn, when Jiping and I traveled through the Central Plains, we encountered a group of insurrectionist bandits seeking to profit from the nation's misfortune." Gu Yuan's voice was slow, his tone even gentler than the motions of his fingers. "With the help of old Sai, we took care of those miscreants and captured their leader. That bandit called himself Fire Dragon. He was covered in scars and had a burn across his face. In the course of his interrogation, we found a barbarian woman's sword. It had once belonged to Hugaar." Changgung's hand trembled violently. The silk handkerchief slipped out of his grip and fluttered to the ground. He bent to retrieve it with a stricken expression, but Gu Yuan caught his hand. "Can you really remember what happened at such a young age?" Gu Yuan asked softly. Changgung's hand was as cold as that of a corpse. Gu Yuan sighed. "Miss Chun's told me everything already. As for that, don't." Changgung cut him off. Gu Yuan obediently shut his mouth and said no more, watching him in silence. Changgung sat stiffly, but his hands became suddenly nimble as he quickly dressed Gu Yuan's wound bite. As he finished, he rose to his feet and turned away from Gu Yuan. "It's been years since the Prince Yan estate was built, but there's no one looking after things there all this time. It's not very appropriate, so I'll return to the Grand Council first thing in the morning. Once I take care of business there, I'll move my things over to the Prince Yan estate." Gu Yuan's expression abruptly clouded over. Changgung's incoherent speech stuttered to a halt. He couldn't help but recall how overwhelmed he'd felt at Gu Yuan's sudden change of heart when he'd come to the Northwest at year's end to deliver rewards to the troops. Had that only been because he'd learned the truth about Huarge? Because he pitied him? It was illogical. Changgung had no qualms about bearing his old scars to Li Feng, but when it came to Gu Yuan, He kept himself tightly covered, afraid to let him glimpse even the smallest of clues. He thought he'd done a good job keeping things under wraps, yet the truth had still leaked out through the gaps between his fingers. Chang'eng clenched his jaw. He could still taste the blood in his mouth from when he had lost himself just minutes ago, coppery and sweet. Ever since he'd received word that Gu Yun would return to the capital to report on his duties, Chang'eng had spent every waking moment looking forward to his return. Every second had felt like torture as it ticked by. Yet, when the long-awaited Gu Yun finally arrived, Chang'eng wished to disappear from this man's sight. His mind was a tumultuous mess, and his instincts screamed at him to flee. He turned toward the door to leave at once. "Stop right there. Where are you going?" Gu Yun asked. Chang'eng, in his muddle-headed daze, ignored him. "Li Min!" Gu Yun snapped. In all Chang'eng's life, Gu Yun had rarely spoken to him harshly, much less in anger. But he was unused to being questioned. In the army, no one dared to do so due to his high rank. Such a stern reprimand carried a hint of fury and the deadly sound of metal striking stone. Chang'eng shivered as he instinctively came to a stop. Gu Yun's expression was grim as an overcast sky as he sat by the bed. "Get the hell over here." Chang'eng was lost. "Walk through that door today and I'll break your legs," Gu Yun said, an audible chill in his voice. "Even His Majesty won't be able to save you. Get back here. Don't make me say it a third time." Chang'eng didn't know what to say. Here was the first person to openly threaten to break Prince Yan's legs since he began chairing the Grand Council. Confounded by Gu Yun's sudden fit of temper, Chang'eng really didn't dare take another step. He screwed up his courage and glanced back over his shoulder at Gu Yun. All sorts of unspeakable grievances and agonies welled up in his chest. His face was still stained with tears, but he was already too clear-headed to cry anymore. Gu Yun seriously couldn't stand the way Chang'eng was looking at him. He stood and stepped forward to meet Chang'eng as if in compromise and embraced him from behind. Then he all but dragged him back and tossed him onto the bed, tugging the now cool sheets over him. "All these years, why didn't you tell me?" Chang'eng took a deep breath. "I was scared," he said quietly. "Scared of what?" Startled, Gu Yun lifted Chang'eng's face with his hand. "Scared of whom? Scared of me?" Chang'eng gazed at him deeply. With that single look, Gu Yun suddenly understood the meaning of the words, "Love begets fear." At first, Gu Yun wanted to ask, "Why would you be scared of me? Did you think I'd scorn you? That I'd doubt you?" But even as the words reached the tip of his tongue, he swallowed them back down. For a moment, he didn't know what to say, so he acted instead. He grabbed Chang'eng by the collar and kissed him firmly on the mouth. Chang'eng's breathing immediately grew heavy. Bracing himself with a hand beside Chang'eng's ear, Gu Yun raised an eyebrow. "Are you still scared of me now?" Chang'eng stared. Gu Yun gazed imperiously down at him, and a wave of heat surged in his heart. Licking his lips, he decided he might as well go all in with the indecent behavior and reached for the front of Chang'eng's disheveled robes. There came a sudden knock at the door, shattering the mood. An unfortunate and undiscerning soul by the name of Huo called out, "Your Highness, it's almost time for morning court. Do you require assistance changing your robes?" Gu Yun was speechless. They tussled the whole night through, and before they knew it, day was about to dawn. Huo Dan's first round of knocks were met with silence. Thinking Chang'eng must be so exhausted he'd failed to hear, he was about to knock again when the door suddenly swung open. Captain Huo nearly jumped out of his skin when he saw who it was. My lord," he stuttered in astonishment. When did their Marshal Gu come home? And how did he get in without alerting any of the estate guards? Did he jump over the wall? Inside the room, Chang'eng felt rather awkward. Straightening his sorry appearance, he called out, "I'll be right there." Gu Yun cut him off with a voice that brooked no protest. "Go beg sick leave on behalf of His Highness. He won't be attending court today." Huo Dan was shocked. "Then shall I send for an imperial physician?" he asked. "An imperial physician?" "Imperial physicians are all a waste of space," Gu Yuan peevishly cast down this casual piece of slander before turning back into the room. "Don't bother us unless it's urgent. Now go." Huotan was flabbergasted. Chang'eng, now arbitrarily detained, looked at the aggressive and bossy Gu Yuan in mild exasperation. "I'm not sick." "If you're not sick, does that make me the sick one in this equation?" Gu Yuan dug out a packet of pacifying fragrance and dumped a handful into the incense burner standing nearby. There was no need to dance around it anymore. "Miss Chun asked me to bring this back for you." A subtle and refreshing scent filled the room. Chang'eng sniffed the air. "Miss Chun changed her formula?" Gu Yuan rubbed at the teeth marks on his arm. "Bitey little lunatic." The pacifying fragrance quickly took effect, filling Chang'eng's lungs and relaxing his body until he couldn't muster the slightest bit of strength or hostility. He leaned weakly against the head of the bed and stared up at Gu Yuan with vacant, glassy eyes. His hair was loose and disheveled, and he seemed utterly spent. Yet his disoriented gaze chased after Gu Yuan. All in all, he looked rather sickly, nothing like a man who possessed a silver tongue but iron teeth. "Zishi, can I hold you?" Chang'eng murmured. "What a sap," Gu Yuan thought. Nevertheless, he came over and sat on the bed, allowing Chang'eng to lean over and relentlessly wrap his arms around Gu Yuan's waist however he pleased. "Beg sickness." Gu Yuan broke the extended silence. "Isn't there the Grand Council? Jiang Hanshi is fairly capable. He merely lacked opportunity before. Now that he's been promoted, I'm sure he'll flex his skills. The tribute of violet gold from the western regions will arrive in the capital in a matter of days. We can take a proper rest for a few years. The barbarians have no skill in industry and manufacturing. We can afford to drag this out. But Jiala Yinghua can't. As time goes on, the situation on the northern front will undoubtedly undergo a shift. All that remains is Jiangnan. The foreigners have traveled thousands of kilometers across the sea at enormous expense to get here. But even a strong dragon cannot defeat a snake in its own nest. No matter what happens, we hold the advantage, right?" Chang'eng lay in his arms and opened his eyes a crack. He could feel Gu Yuan's calloused fingers absent-mindedly stroking the top of his head, making his scalp tingle. "The reforms have just begun," Gu Yuan said in a low voice. "You were the only one who initiated them, but they haven't raised too many waves with the other officials. In fact, most of them seem to tacitly agree with you. If you retreat now, regardless of whether the reforms succeed or fail, the rewards and consequences will fall on someone else. Don't fight for credit, and you won't necessarily take the blame either. So, let's forget all this. Go home and rest for a couple of years, okay?" Of the thousands of words Shen Yi spewed, the only ones Gu Yuan had taken to heart were, "How will he clean up this mess in the future?" The Gu family had borne the title of Marquis for generations, and they were members of the imperial household to boot. The rise and fall of influential officials, the ebb and flow of bureaucracy, Gu Yuan had seen it all. He was eminently aware of the end that awaited prominent ministers and valiant generals. Even in times of great prosperity, how many imperial kinsmen managed to escape the vengeance meted out by the powerful enemies and their critics' clever pens? After a long silence, Chang'eng finally responded. "I can't retreat," he said quietly. "The first incision has already been made. We're scraping poison from the bone, and the patient's flesh has already been cut open. If I turn back now, ought I leave them with their skin sliced open or sew them back together again?" Government reforms were merely the first step. If they were regarded as merely a means to implement the war beacon tickets, they would go no further than this. He was certain that in the future, after the end of the war, or perhaps even before, there would come a time when the whole court fought over the war beacon tickets. When that day came, not only would corruption become widespread, the war beacon tickets themselves would become completely worthless. And if that should happen, Great Liang would fall yet more rapidly into decline. Gu Yuan tightened his arms around him. When Chang'eng opened his eyes once more, the bloodlust and twin pupils had faded away. He flipped over, clumsily pressing Gu Yuan, this man who occupied his thoughts day and night, into the soft brocade blankets. "Zishi, do you know what Wu-Er-Ge is?" Gu Yuan blinked in surprise. Wu-Er-Ge is the name of a wicked god. It's also the oldest curse the barbarians know. When their tribe is on the verge of annihilation, they take a pair of children and refine them into a wuarge. The resulting individuals possess unparalleled strength. They will call down a rain of carnage and destroy any enemy, no matter how powerful. Chang'eng lay on top of Gu Yuan, and his chest thrummed as he spoke. Though slightly hoarse, his voice was as gentle as ever. Before she died, Huarga told me that by the end of my life, my heart would be filled with only hatred, brutality, and suspicion, that I would become a violent lover of bloodshed with carnage following in my footsteps, that I'd be doomed to drag everyone to a miserable death, that no one would love me or treat me with sincerity. Gu Yuan sucked in a sharp breath. He'd always felt that, as a child, Chang'eng had had far too many concerns weighing on him. His mind was labyrinthine, filled with countless twists and turns, impossible to fathom. He never expected that at the end of those twists and turns lay such a noxious sequence of words. But there is someone who loves me and treats me with sincerity. Right? Just now, it was you who brought me back to myself, Chang'eng said quietly. There wasn't a day she treated me with warmth. I refused to live according to her wishes. Do you trust me? Zishi, as long as you say the word, I will climb any mountain of swords and wade through any sea of flames. Chapter 79. A Heart to Heart. He was the illustrious Prince Yan, the leader of the Grand Council. Yet every time he jolted awake from the nightmares Xuniang had branded into his bones, the only person he could think of, yearn for, anticipate, and believe in was Gu Yuan. The weight of this one person was so heavy in his heart that there were times he struggled to carry the burden. Great Master Liao Zhen had once told him, "The suffering of mankind lies not in letting go, but in holding on. The more things you hold, the fuller your hands, and the more they will weigh you down with every step forward." These words resonated deeply with Chang'eng, and he had to admit that Liao Zhen was right. To him, Gu Yuan alone weighed over 1,000 kilograms, yet he was incapable of letting him go. The moment he did, he would have nothing left. If a person didn't have anything worth treasuring in their life, wouldn't they just be a ship without a rudder, drifting wherever the currents carried them? Gu Yuan wrapped an arm around Chang'eng's shoulder and tapped lightly at the curve where his shoulder met his neck. Chang'eng winced in pain, but his gaze, fixed on Gu Yuan, never wavered. "Why on earth would I want you to climb over a mountain of swords and wade through a sea of flames?" Gu Yuan asked. "I want there to come a day when the nation is thriving and the common people have worthwhile work, when the whole country is at peace and my general need not defend our borders to the death. I want to take a stand like Master Feng Han and unravel the tangled relationship between imperial authority and violet gold. I want all the land-bound steam engines to be ones that work the fields, and for the giant kites soaring overhead to be filled with ordinary folks traveling to visit their ancestral homes with their entire families in tow. I want every person to be able to live with dignity." Chang'eng tightened his hand around Gu Yuan's, interlacing their fingers until they were intimately entangled. Gu Yuan was taken aback. This was the first time Chang'eng had bared his heart to him like this. Listening to him speak, Gu Yuan felt his blood begin to race, but he stopped to think about it carefully. Every single one of these things seemed unfortunately unattainable. "I can do it, Zishi. Let me try," Chang'eng said in a low voice. He had the strength of a wicked god. Why shouldn't he try to pull apart this bloody world and establish an unprecedented new path for the common folk? Back in Yanhui town, a 14-year-old boy had once told a young general who'd barely come of age his vision of what constituted a life worth living. At the time, Gu Yuan, who had yet to shed the recklessness of youth, had dumped a proverbial bucket of ice water over his head, coldly informing him that heroes don't get happy endings. Now, after several tours of duty in the yellow sands of the desert and a visit to the imperial dungeons, Marshal Gu had personally lived those words of warning. Yet for some reason, he found himself unable to utter them a second time before Chang'eng. If Gu Yuan were in Chang'eng's shoes and someone pointed at him and said, "Gu Yuan, You ought to hurry and fuck off back to the Marquis estate to enjoy your life in retirement. You're lucky you've managed to survive till now. If you don't retreat today, sooner or later you'll die an ignominious death. How would he feel? Life in this world was like trudging through icy sludge. It was inevitable that one would struggle to make progress. Over time, one naturally froze through and through. How difficult it was to maintain a heart that shed hot blood, that pressed ahead despite knowing one faced the impossible. If, on top of all of that, someone should place more obstacles in their way, if even their closest friends and family did so, wouldn't that be far too sorrowful? Guyun was silent for a long time. Just as Chang'ang began to show subtle signs of nervousness, he opened his mouth. I've kissed you and hugged you. What more do you want me to say? Men who talk too much don't have time for other things. Understand? Astonished, Chang'ang watched as, with the flip of Guyuan's fingers, the half-dead gas lamp beside the bed went out. Dawn had yet to break, and the room was plunged into darkness. The bed curtains that were ordinarily tied back drifted gently in the cool early morning breeze that spilled through the gap in the window and fluttered down, obscuring everything. Before Chang'ang could react, he felt the fabric loosen at his waist. At some point, his belt had disappeared. Chang'ang was still caught up in his oath about the mountain of swords and sea of flames and had yet to regather his wits. With the foom, his face went bright red. Zishi. Guyuan hummed absent-mindedly in response as he impatiently flung off the silk cloth covering his wounded arm. Leaning back lazily into the pile of soft brocade blankets, he trailed the tip of his finger over Chang'ang's lapel. Back at the hot spring villa, you said you dreamed of me. What did you dream about exactly? Chang'ang made no response. Aren't you quite the skilled speaker? Guyuan chuckled softly. Let's hear it. Chang'ang had never before experienced such provocative flirtation. His tongue promptly tied itself into a knot. When it comes to this sort of thing, isn't it enough just to think about it? Guyuan caressed Chang'ang's waist through his clothes, then slid his hand down to where thigh melted into pelvis. Chang'ang nearly leapt right out of the bed as he forgot how to breathe. Overwhelmed, he seized Guyuan's mischievous hands. A line of fire scorched its way from his belly to his throat. He felt as though he were about to be burned to ash. Meanwhile, Guyuan had already loosened his lapels. As cool air touched Chang'ang's chest, he seemed to come to a realization. He tried to pin down Guyuan's questing hand, but it was too late. The scars of all sizes that covered his chest beneath the collar were exposed. As those lightly calloused fingers skimmed over them, the sensation was indescribable. On one hand, Chang'ang couldn't help but flinch away. On the other, his mouth was dry, his ears faintly ringing. He didn't know whether to advance or retreat. Guyuan had been traveling for days, then spent a whole night waiting beside his own bed. As luck would have it, the bit of medicine he'd taken chose this precise moment to wear off. His vision began to blur, but the mood was perfect. It wouldn't do to dig out his glass monocle now and spoil the ambiance. Wearing it made him feel like an artificer preparing to dismantle a suit of armor. Thus, he relied entirely on his sense of touch. He slid his hands over the uneven surface of Chang'ang's scars, the feeling even more shocking than seeing the marks with his eyes. Do they hurt? Guyuan asked quietly. Chang'ang lowered his gaze to stare at him intently, then sidestepped the question. They healed ages ago. 100 different emotions welled up in Guyuan's heart. For a moment, even his surging lust subsided. He narrowed his increasingly unfocused eyes and carefully stroked his fingers over those scars. Chang'ang couldn't bear it anymore. With a soft whimper, he grabbed Guyuan's wrist. Don't be scared, Guyuan coaxed him. I'll take good care of you. If the half-blind man could have seen Chang'ang's face just then, he probably wouldn't have said anything like, don't be scared. Chang'ang leaned down and kissed him, and Guyuan grew impatient once more. Yet just as he was about to press Chang'ang onto his back and get down to business, for some unfathomable reason, Chang'ang suddenly blurted out, Yifu. Guyun froze. Guyun froze. With this single utterance from Chang'eng, Guyun went soft. His blazing carnal desire, so intense a moment ago, was instantly extinguished, stamped out, and shoved into an iron cage. Guyun sucked in several heaving breaths. He had half a mind to shout, "What the hell are you saying at a time like this?" But after thinking on it, he realized the guy wasn't entirely off the mark. Apparently, there were some men who privately enjoyed the thrill of such moral taboos and were eager for their lovers to call them all sorts of nonsense in bed. Unfortunately, Guyuan had absolutely zero interest in such things. He couldn't understand the appeal at all. In the past half year, he had finally, with great effort, grown accustomed to Chang'eng addressing him with his courtesy name. He had also slowly stopped viewing him as his godson. Yet he had never expected to crash head first into the word Yifu at such a critical moment. The force of the impact left him dizzy with shock. Chang'eng didn't seem to notice his discomfort. He called out to Guyuan with that moniker several more times, as if unable to help himself, and kissed him haphazardly again and again. Folded within this intimacy was a piousness that made the old pervert feel as though he were sitting on pins and needles. Coupled with the Yifu appellation, the resulting effect was rather remarkable. Guyuan felt as if his entire body were crawling with ants. In the end, he couldn't bear it any longer and turned his face away. "Stop calling me that." Chang'eng paused and gazed at him for a few beats in silence. Then he leaned in and murmured into Guyuan's ear, "Yifu, if you can't see clearly, then close your eyes, okay?" No matter how hard of hearing Guyuan might be, and he wasn't even all that deaf yet, he could tell Chang'eng was doing this on purpose. "You're into this, aren't you?" Chang'eng's eyes gleamed breathtakingly bright within the darkness of the bed curtains. He lowered his voice and softened his tone, relentless as he pouted into Guyuan's ear. "Yifu, back then, you told me you would protect me even once we reached the capital. Do you remember?" Guyuan's face contorted through several different expressions. He was completely defenseless against Chang'eng's new style of mischief and could only plan a strategic retreat. He pushed Chang'eng away. "That's enough. Stop being shameless. Don't you have work to do?" "And what work am I supposed to do?" Taking advantage of his position, Chang'eng pressed Guyuan back down into the bed. His hand had already found its way to the arch of Guyuan's lower back. Back in Jiayu Pass, when he had realigned a certain man's bones, he had become intimately familiar with his body. Now, with the doctor's firm hand and ruthless accuracy, he struck. Guyuan shuddered violently and felt himself go weak at the waist. He instinctively tried to curl in on himself, but Chang'eng tapped a handful of acupoints, and half of Guyuan's body went numb. Giving me flashbacks of Yan Wushi. Chang'eng calmly picked up where he left off. "Didn't Yifu just help me beg sick leave? Aren't you going to take good care of me?" "Bastard!" Guyuan swore. Chang'eng turned a deaf ear. He seized his opportunity and closed in on Guyuan. In a manner that left no room for dissent, he pressed his knee between Guyuan's legs, shoving them apart. Guyuan broke out into goose flesh. He pushed at Chang'eng's shoulder, caught that disrespectful hand, and twisted it behind Chang'eng's back. Chang'eng didn't resist, his body yielding as he allowed Guyuan to manhandle him as he pleased. Tilting his head back to reveal the vulnerable line of his neck, he murmured coyly, "Do you want me, Yifu?" Guyuan hesitated. He couldn't get over this hurdle in his heart. The instant his grip loosened, Chang'eng slipped free like a loach and once again pressed in. He embraced him, running his hands along Guyuan's spine as he breathed into his ear. In that case, why not allow this dutiful son to attend to Yifu's needs? Guyuan didn't know what to say. He was starting to realize that perhaps it was his unlucky year. Perhaps he had incurred the wrath of Tai Sui. That must be why he was suffering one setback after another. The sun climbed high overhead and the sky turned bright in the blink of an eye. The dazzling light of early summer streamed through the bed curtains in thin bars, yet their brightness paled in comparison to the brilliance of Changgung's eyes. He finally understood the meaning of, after years of wishful thinking, it takes but a moment to fall fully into delirium. His nightmares were far more terrifying than reality, but reality was far more maddening than his erotic dreams. After the madness passed, he didn't feel hollowed out at all. His mind was at ease, more at ease than it had ever been in his entire life, as his hands wandered over Gu Yuan's body without pause. He said Gu Yuan's name again and again, his lips tucked against Gu Yuan's ear, such that even he found himself a bit annoying. But he couldn't control himself, couldn't stop. He called Gu Yuan all sorts of appellations at random. Sometimes it was Yifu, while other times it was Zishi. The syllables pressed against Gu Yuan's ears and burrowed down, forcing the deaf man to hear them, though his medicine had long worn off. Gu Yuan could feel a steady stream of heated breath brushing against the side of his neck. Earlier, thanks to a momentary slip on his part, Gu Yuan had missed the opportunity to take control of the situation and been thoroughly ravished by the little brat. Now, he was sleepy and tired, yet still, Changgeng wouldn't let him be. Unable to reason with him, Gu Yuan grumpily pushed him away. "Be quiet." When he saw the exhaustion on Gu Yuan's face, Changgeng obediently shut his mouth. Instead, he began to lightly knead at Gu Yuan's lower back. He used just the right amount of pressure, relieving Gu Yuan's fatigued muscles without triggering his extraordinary ticklishness. Gu Yuan chewed out this revelation in silence. So last time, he had been tickling him on purpose. Chen Qingxu, that quack, was she teaching Changgeng to cure disease and save lives, or was she imparting crooked sorcery? He was about to give Changgeng a piece of his mind when Changgeng suddenly frowned. Laying his palm over Gu Yuan's chest, he pressed lightly against his ribs a few times before grabbing Gu Yuan's wrist and settling his fingers against his pulse. Gu Yuan snapped. "What are you—" "When did you get injured again?" Changgeng interrupted. Gu Yuan turned mute. Shit. It seemed, aside from crooked sorcery, that charlatan Chun really did teach Changgeng some actual medicine if he could detect it with just a touch. At this moment of crisis, Gu Yuan whipped out his tried and true weapon. "I'm deaf. I can't hear anything at all." Affecting an expression of perfect innocence, he rolled over with his back to Changgeng and fell still, indicating that he had fallen asleep. All irrelevant parties ought to take their leave. Changgeng examined him from head to toe, but it had already been quite some time since Gu Yuan had acquired those terrifying blast injuries. Changgeng's medical expertise wasn't quite as remarkable as that of Chen Qingxu, and by this point, Gu Yuan's wounds had more or less healed. Changgeng was unable to find anything of note, and thus the two of them had each successfully managed to pull one over on the other. His Highness Prince Yan claimed illness and did not show his face in court for an entire day. Important ministers of the palace and Grand Council all sent representatives to ask after his health, but each and every one was rebuffed by Huo Dan. Huo Dan had come up through the military. He would never disobey a direct order from his commanding officer. If Gu Yuan said they were not to be disturbed, then Huo Dan would stand by the front gate in silence like a door god and forbid anyone from doing so. Meanwhile, despite pondering it at length, Huo Dan still couldn't figure out how Gu Yuan had managed to sneak in. With little better to do, he spent his time tightening up the lax security of the Marquis estate. Gu Yuan had raced back to the capital like a bat out of hell and returned 2 days earlier than anticipated, then went an entire night without sleeping. Sure, he'd finally managed to eat his fill, but he'd ended up in the wrong position and nearly choked to death. Physically and mentally spent, he slept late into the afternoon. When he awoke, his body and mind still felt extremely strange. Who knew whose sick leave it was at this point? He wanted to chew Changgeng out, but at the same time, he felt that verbally eviscerating him over such trifles would make him appear petty. In the end, he suddenly thought to himself, "Next time, I'll have to make sure to sew his mouth shut." Guyuan groped around for his glass monocule, but the small object had disappeared. He fumbled around fruitlessly for half an age until a warm hand took hold of his own. Leaning in next to his ear, Chang'e said, "General Shun and the others haven't yet arrived. You don't have to go out today. So can you not take your medicine? I'll take care of you." Guyuan didn't use his medicine all that often these days anyway, so he nodded, unconcerned. "You don't have to take care of me. I'm used to it. I can't find my monocle. Go fetch me a spare." Chang'e hugged him tightly, refusing to let go. "I took your monocle. I'm not giving it back." Their relationship had undergone a subtle shift that was difficult to describe. Truth be told, even when they had still been godfather and godson, their relationship had always been incredibly close. When Chang'e had brazenly unleashed his amorous feelings in the heat of battle, Guyuan had initially tried to deflect him, using gentle persuasion and compromise until, eventually, he'd found himself ensnared as well. Personal letters and battle reports had come and gone in an unbroken stream, and the depth of affection expressed therein could certainly be considered profound. Yet none of it could compare to the ardent passion they felt now. Even were the enemy to besiege the capital a second time, they would dismiss it from their minds. Their entire world had shrunk down to a tiny patch of earth containing only two. Nothing else mattered. "Why did you take my monocule?" Guyuan asked. Chang'e smiled. "I like it." He carefully helped Guyuan into his clothes, then bent to help him slip into his shoes, his every motion painstakingly attentive. Prince Yan, with his plain clothes and ascetic habits, always seemed much like a monk. Those who didn't know him well would assume him a paragon of virtue. But after this latest encounter, Guyuan finally realized that this man's dignified skin hid a mountain of unspeakable interests far beyond ordinary human understanding. He liked what? The fact that Guyuan was blind? Chang'e wasn't a particularly loud speaker, so to make sure Guyuan could hear him, he whispered his words directly into Guyuan's ear. Even phrases like, "mind the doorsill," made Guyuan feel as though they were intimately entwined. When he reached the door, Gu, the blind, instinctively reached out to feel for the door frame, but found his hand gently yet implacably intercepted by Chang'e. "Don't touch anything," Chang'e said, unyielding. "Just hold on to me." Chang'e had nearly taken leave of his senses, mesmerized by this unprecedented measure of control. He refused to release Guyuan for even a second. Every now and then, he would say a few words before leaning in to request a kiss. He was thoroughly enjoying himself and didn't seem at all tired of this enterprise. Guyuan, on the other hand, soon grew agitated by the sticky sweetness of it all. Heaven help him! Guyuan just didn't get it. Previously, Chang'e had been so distant and restrained that he found it inappropriate to even look at Guyuan while helping him dress. How on earth did a man like that become so unhinged after having sex once? Guyuan tactfully rejected his proposal. "I can't see. That doesn't mean I can't walk. You don't have to keep clinging to me. Aren't you fantastically busy?" Chang'e kissed his earlobe. "Then come with me to the study." After Guyuan had left for the northwest, his study had basically become Chang'e's domain. Guyuan was on the borders year-round. When he walked in, the room seemed foreign for a moment. Chang'e helped him to a chair. As they sat with sunlight streaming over them from that familiar angle, Guyuan suddenly remembered something. He stretched out his leg, and his foot bumped a little wooden stool, just as expected. "This whole thing is actually still here." Chang'e leaned down to pick it up. Drawn in vibrant detail on the stool's wooden surface was a group of tiny tortoises biting each other's tails to form a circle. Next to the doodle, etched in a childish script, were the words, "Though long lives the sacred tortoise, surround him 10-1. These lines were utterly mismatched. Chang'e laughed until he ran out of breath. He tugged Guyuan's hand over and pressed it to the inscription. "You're doing?" "Don't laugh. I didn't do much serious studying as a child." Guyuan's eyes curved in a smile. "And what little studying I did was at the palace with His Majesty and Prince Wei. The old Marquis wasn't exactly a lettered man himself. He mostly read books on military strategy. He hired a pedantic old Confucian scholar to come recite the classics at me, but I'd fallen asleep listening to him drone on after less than an hour. I had to find other ways to amuse myself. Oh, you can go ahead and do whatever you need to. It's been ages since I've been home. I'll just walk around a bit myself. No, wait, Chang'ang said hastily. I like listening to you talk. What happened next? Guyuan looked embarrassed. It really wasn't anything to be proud of, but it was rare to see Chang'ang so lighthearted. After a moment of hesitation, Guyuan decided to visit this as a means to make him happy and continued. Back then, I was the worst troublemaker you can imagine. Even my Xianxiang grew to fear my antics. But he didn't dare lecture me to my face. Instead, he would go lodge his complaints with the old Marquis behind my back. If my old man didn't beat me, he'd punish me by making me hold a horse stance while standing on a bench. I'd fall at the slightest wobble. That bastard was seriously nothing like a real dad. I felt that old goat was a despicable person, forever tattling on me. So I hatched a plan with Shen Jiping. We swiped some laxatives and secretly dumped them all into Xianxiang's tea. Honestly, a single dose of laxatives might not have been so bad, but we were both young and reckless, and Xianxiang was old and in poor health. He nearly died from our prank. Never in 200 years of the Gu family's history had there ever been such a wicked little miscreant. The old Marquis was apoplectic and wanted to whip me to death. Thankfully, the princess stopped him. Oh, but my mom later told me it wasn't that she didn't want to see me beaten, but that her own body was weak, so it was difficult for her to conceive. She feared if I were flogged to death, it would spell the end of the Gu line. Chang'ang took a moment to imagine the scene. If he had such a hellion for a child, he probably would have tried to whip him to death too. But when he remembered the nightmare child in question was Guyuan, he felt that if he were the old Marquis, even if someone really had died, his only option would be to pay for that life with his own. He would never have the heart to harm a hair on Guyuan's head. After trying and failing to restrain his laughter, he asked, "And then what happened?" Guyuan hesitated. He really couldn't maintain the smile on his face any longer. His mirthful expression faded, and after a lengthy silence, he finally said, "And then my parents decided I would become absolutely lawless if things went on this way. They took me with them to the Black Iron Battalion's encampment on the northern border." And thus his rowdy childhood had come to a swift end. Chapter 80. Secret Concern. Those days were probably the most indelibly painful time of his life. Guyuan paused. He hadn't planned on continuing this story, but perhaps these words had been stored in his heart for too many years. He found himself unable to stop. Life on the northern border was truly bitter. The war had just ended, and there were wounded soldiers everywhere you looked. The sun set over yellow sand every day, and not even the princess's tent could you drink a mouthful of hot tea. How could it possibly be as agreeable as the life of a noble young master in the capital? I threw a furious tantrum at first. I wanted to go back, but the old Marquis refused. When he was fed up with my tantrums, he dragged me to the drill grounds as punishment. Every day, when the officers of the Black Iron Battalion drilled their troops, I had to follow along and train alongside them. If I slacked off even a little, he would beat me right there in full view of those iron giants. The old Marquis had a good read on his son's lousy personality. The boy was finicky and unruly, but though the little brat barely cleared the height of a grown man's thighs, he would never humiliate himself by crying before an audience. Chang'ang had plastered himself to Guyuan's back, resting his chin on Guyuan's shoulder. Now he ghosted his lips over the base of Guyuan's ear. "Had I been born 20 years earlier," he said quietly, "I would have picked you up and stolen you away. I would have raised you properly in the lap of luxury." Guyuan considered the picture painted by Chang'ang's words. It was so sappy he didn't know how to respond, torn as he was between laughter and tears. To be honest, when he thought about it objectively, many of the families that lived so extravagantly didn't survive past 3 generations. Guyuan came from just such an affluent background, and he was also an only son. If he really had been allowed to grow up in the capital, wild as he pleased, who knew how ungovernable he would have become? Only with a hard-hearted father like the old Marquis, who had no qualms about using such vicious methods of discipline, would the Black Iron Battalion gain a worthy successor. But who could have imagined the enormous price paid to see Gu Yuan make something of himself? Uncle Wang said your temperament changed after you returned from the northern border. You didn't want to see anyone and ignored everyone you met. Chang'eng paused, then tugged Gu Yuan's hand close, riding into his palm. Do you hate the late emperor? Gu Yuan unconsciously groped for the fine wine jar at his waist. Only after he'd reached out did he remember he'd decided to stop drinking. The jar of wine had long been removed. Gu Yuan pressed his lips into a thin line. I don't. Go pour me a cup of tea. For a moment, Chang'eng thought he'd heard wrong. In the days after the capital siege, Gu Yuan had been so grievously wounded he could barely sit up. Yet every time he opened his mouth, it was to recklessly demand wine. How was it that after fighting a few battles in the western regions, he suddenly understood the importance of preserving his health? Chang'eng had always been quietly critical of this alcoholic's drinking habits, but this unexpected change of disposition caused his heart to stumble in his chest with a thud, more shocked than happy. Rising to his feet, he brewed a cup of spring tea for Gu Yuan and surreptitiously pressed his fingers to Gu Yuan's wrist, a frisson of suspicious concern once again unfurling in his heart. He hated that his inferior skills couldn't seem to detect a thing. Even without the use of his eyes and ears, Gu Yuan could sense Chang'eng's tension. He realized he'd accidentally given himself away. Chang'eng was much too perceptive. As a famously flawed individual, it would have been better to keep up his terrible habits. The people who cleaned up after him were already accustomed to it. On the contrary, a sudden change of course would serve only to alarm. Gu Yuan casually gulped down the tea, then licked his lips and said, I don't know where I left my wine jar. Do you have any of old Mr. Shun's home brew left? To Chang'eng, this sounded much more like Gu Yuan's usual style. After all that worrying, it turned out he was merely thirsty from talking so much. Relaxing slightly, Chang'eng readily shot him down. It's all gone. You'll have to settle for tea. Gu Yuan clicked his tongue without much sincerity. In the next moment, something was pressed to his mouth, and the sticky, sweet fragrance of glutinous rice assaulted his nose. Gu Yuan reared back. What's this? I don't want... Chang'eng had leaned forward and fed him the item in question from between his own lips. Gu Yuan's brow twisted into a knot. He disliked eating sweets and could barely stand the nauseatingly sweet combination of Chang'eng and that lump of tea pastry. But he didn't spit it back out. As with that eggshell-studded bowl of soup noodles all those years ago, he wolfed the whole thing down. Chewing through the cloying bean paste filling, the taste so oversweet it was almost bitter, he suddenly felt a flicker of unease. Chang'eng's soppy displays of affection were abnormal. Likewise, his rapid shift to anxious suspicion when he heard Gu Yuan ask for tea was also abnormal. Such emotional extremes were exhausting and typically couldn't be sustained for long. In most, they lasted for a short while, after which they would devolve into either apathy or confusion, or the person in question would shift their attention, allowing those feelings to dissipate out of an instinctive sense of self-preservation. Chang'eng. Gu Yuan's expression turned solemn. Chang'eng, give me my monocle. No. Chang'eng encircled Gu Yuan with his arms from the side, as if to keep him captive. He persisted with his interrogation. Why don't you hate him? His voice was eager, yet detached. An eagerness stemming from a desire to get to the bottom of this matter and determine whether or not Gu Yuan felt an animosity toward the late emperor. As if the instant Gu Yuan admitted that yes, he did hate him, Chang'eng would promptly take some particular action. A detachment that manifested in his apparent disregard for the fact that the late emperor of whom he spoke of was his father. He mentioned the man with the indifference one reserved for a stray cat or dog on the side of the road. Gu Yuan's heart sank. After a beat of silence, he responded to Chang'eng's query with one of his own. What about you? Do you still hate Hu Ga'ar? Chang'eng didn't expect Gu Yuan to toss this question back at him. He blinked in mild surprise. If Gu Yuan had been able to see, he would have found that though they were no longer red, the shadow of a second pupil yet lurked within Changgung's eyes. If she were to stand before me now, Changung replied in lofty tones, I would tear out her tendons and skin her alive. But she died a tragic death without a proper burial. Even if I wished to dig her back up and whip her course, it would be a futile effort. However much I loathe her, I have no way to vent my hatred. And if I had, isn't that exactly what she would want, since it would speed the work of the poison in my body? That was absolutely not how Changung truly felt. No matter how careless or deaf Gu Yuan might be, he could still tell this much. Gu Yuan was about to respond when he felt the person plastered to his side flinch. It was the panicked startle of one who had poured their full concentration into an endeavor and been suddenly interrupted. A slight breeze drifted in at their backs. Someone had opened the door to the study. Gu Yuan turned. Is that Uncle Wang or Old Huo? Standing at the door, the old housekeeper raised his voice and called out, My lord, it's me. The Lingshu Institute has sent someone over to see His Highness Prince Yan. The twin pupils in Changgung's eyes dwindled to one, as if stimulated by a bright light. He reflexively released Gu Yuan, showing his usual, touch not that which runs contrary to propriety, brand of restraint. Yet halfway through his transformation, he seemed to recall something, a lost expression flickering across his face. Gu Yuan acted as if he didn't notice. Go ahead and take care of what business you need to. It's been days since I had a proper meal, so I'm off to find one. And that thing you made me eat, I choked it down, but it's given me heartburn. Changung started in surprise, then clapped a hand to his forehead and rubbed his brow in dismay. I really... He jumped to his feet. I'll go tell the kitchens to make you something easy to digest, he said, agitated. Uncle Wang was quick to obey. Understood. This old servant will go at once. Changung bolted toward the door of the study, then stopped short as he remembered something. He patted himself down and pulled Gu Yuan's glass monocule from his lapels. He turned to hand it to Gu Yuan. The metal frame and connected chain were warm with his body heat. Changung carefully wiped the lens clean and set it on the bridge of Gu Yuan's nose, his eyes lingering on Gu Yuan's face for a long interval. Suddenly, he said in a low voice, Zushi, just now, I honestly thought I was dreaming. That's the only reason I dare to act so presumptuously. After being flustered by Changgung's bizarre behavior for an entire afternoon, at these words, Gu Yuan nearly blew a gasket. He was sorely tempted to retort, Why don't I slap you so you can see if it hurts? But before he could put thought to action, Changung paused, then straightened back up. In all my life, I've never had such a wonderful dream, he said with a hint of self-mockery. His mouth crooked up in a stiff smile. If only I never woke up. Gu Yuan was silent. The moment Changung returned to normal, Gu Yuan could no longer find it in his heart to castigate him. He felt that, if such a thing were to happen a few more times, Gu Yuan would have no choice but to descend into madness right alongside him. He summoned an inscrutably steady expression and bade him leave with a wave of his hand. All right, everyone, we have reached the end of Arc 9, finishing out with chapters 78 through 80. And you know what? I don't really have anything to say this time around, so let's just go ahead and meet again soon, okay? Well, Einiman.